Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, and good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. This is WeatherBrains episode number 710. This is for Monday, August 26th, 2019. It's the pre-show. You know what this is. It is the magical time of the program where we do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and we say very outrageous things. So what I'm going to do here is get us the right embed code and get us set up for television. For those that don't know, we simulcast this on our local cable channels where I am here. And so we now have that set up, and time to invite everybody. You know, it's interesting that this new platform is so easy. I really don't think we have to do these long pre-shows. I mean, we're not scheduled to start the show here for 18 or 17 minutes at 30 after the hour. It used to be, it took us a while to get everybody on, but now it's kind of easy peasy. So what boring personal stories can I share? Getting ready for the National Weather Association annual meeting, Huntsville, Alabama. That is getting close, a couple of weeks away. And we will be doing this show live from that venue 2 weeks from tonight, assuming we don't have hurricane problems. And we'll be talking about Dorian here on the show. But let's see what I can do here to get some of our regular characters on here. Looks like we have several outages. Saw Kevin is out. Bill Murray is out. Troy Kimmel is out. But I'm going to try everybody else and see who we can find on here. I know Dr. John can join us. So let's keep adding a few more. And let's see if we can get them on here. So there we go. And again, for those that don't know, we changed platforms here a couple of weeks ago, actually 4 weeks ago, and we're using Zoom with lots of success. We're actually very happy with Zoom. Had a chance to do the Storm Front Freaks podcast, and they have released that show into the wild. They just put out a tweet about that. I love the show title for my episode. When I was the guest on their show, the show title, episode 86, Poop and Brute. And that's the reason we do show titles here, is that you have to listen to the show to figure out what is that all about? But that was a lot of fun with Phil and the gang. They do a great job over there. So Storm Front Freaks is the name of that podcast. Okay. Now live, WeatherBrains 710. I just got an email notification, so everything is cooking with gas here. No, this is too easy. I think I'm starting the show too early now. It's just sitting here, me talking, because usually Bill Murray would hop on here, and then we try and get all the guests on here. And I'm hoping that Kim Cloco McLean has the guests' information. If not, I can probably dig that up. I know that we're talking manufactured housing and severe weather safety tonight. So this should be fairly interesting. Mobile home populations. And for those familiar with what I do, my heart, it is mitigating loss of life during severe weather, tornadoes. I'm in a very aggressive tornado market, and we have a lot of loss of life in manufactured housing here. It is what it is. And again, I tell everybody in the industry, I am your best friend. I'm a big advocate, but I'm not going to go on television and say they're safe during a tornado. They're a death trap, like a car. A car is a marvelous thing. You hop in your car, you can drive to any destination you like. but you can't stay in a car during a tornado, and you can't stay in a manufactured home during a tornado. We had a case here back in March of this year where 23 people died from an EF4 tornado in Lee County, Alabama, which is near Auburn and Opelika. And a large percentage of those that died were in trailers. And Kim spent some time down there. She's done research on the ground, so it'll be very interesting to have everybody on here, assuming that we can get them on here. And I just got a note from Aubrey that says, she's out. I might be the only guy on the show here. Just sit here and babble for 90 minutes. She just got back from dance practice, it says. Aubrey is doing a local Dancing with the Stars, which I did several years ago, which was extremely embarrassing. For Aubrey, it will not be embarrassing because she can dance. So we will be missing her tonight. We'll see if we can stir up some of the others. Had a great day Saturday. I was in Cullman, Alabama at Karma's Coffee House. We had more fun. We had the biggest crowd for a book signing. It was just great. The accommodations were great. People were so nice. We had a really long line, but they were understanding. So thanks for everybody that came out. This Saturday, I will be in Childersburg, Alabama at their library. And then next Saturday, which is September 7th, I will be in Huntsville at WeatherFest, which is the big public event prior to the opening of the National Weather Association annual meeting. And that is going to be a wild day. I'll do a book signing at WeatherFest that morning from 9 until noon. At noon, I drive to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where I do weather support for the University of Alabama football games. They have a home game against New Mexico State at Bryant-Denny Stadium. And then I will drive back to Birmingham to take a nap. And then I drive to Huntsville early Sunday morning, the 8th, to go back to the NWA. And I'm speaking early that morning. And my topic is how a television meteorologist covered an EF4 tornado while not being on television. And so if you're interested in severe weather or severe weather communication, that talk might interest you. And again, that part of it is not open to the public. That is for those that are registered and are, attending the conference. It starts that Sunday, the 8th. I know I've got a panel discussion that evening. I've got a panel discussion the next morning. There's a lot of stuff going on. And again, we'll be doing this show from the NWA Monday night, August 9th, live from the Ron, which we did last year in St. Louis. And I'm probably going to have to come back to Warwick at some point. I can't stay for the whole thing this year. And of course, if we have a big hurricane, who knows what happens? There's Kim. Kim, my heart is warm. I thought I was going to be by myself. So thank you for making my heart warm and fuzzy. Do I need to get the guests on, or do you want to do that? Do you want to forward that email, or how you want to do that?
Yeah, I just forwarded it on, or attempted to forward it on to both of them. So hopefully that is taken care of.
Okay. So we have learned that Bill Murray is out. Aubrey Urbanowitz is out. Kevin Selly is out. Troy Kimmel is out.
Oh, no. Wow. We're going to get maybe Nate and John?
John should be here. John sent his pick of the week, and he is active, and he should be here in a matter of minutes. So John should be here, and hopefully Nate will join us. If not, we will handle this because it is a topic that is of great interest to me, and I have a lot of questions for you, too, over this issue, and that you spent time on the ground in Lee County, Alabama.
I did. Well, great. This should be a really good show. And it's I know certainly people who are very near and dear to your heart, and a lot of what Mike and Kevin have gotten to do is talk with people in Alabama about this issue.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm looking forward to it. Let's see, John. We are seeing a graphic that says Cyberlink UCAM. Please start UCAM.
Oh my gosh, he's squeaking too.
We have the helium effect at the same time. Oh, this is great. John, you got to go back and watch the replay. Go back to YouTube and watch the replay, and you'll see what we're hearing. So I don't know what needs to happen. A reboot, because you fix it John hasn't had the audio problem for weeks, and now it's back, and now we don't see you. But literally, it says you. Well, he just hung up, so he's going to read.
I'll give it another
Kevin,
go.
can you hear us?
I can hear you.
I think. Yeah, give us a little mic check there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we might just need you to get a little bit closer to your mic for the show.
Okay.
And do you have any headsets by any chance? Any little earbuds, or because often what happens, we start to hear ourselves coming back through your channel. And if you don't, it's okay. This is a newer platform, and just maybe we won't have that problem here. Traditionally on Hangouts on the Google side, when people didn't have the little earbuds in, we had this artifact that would come down that channel. So
I don't have earbuds.
It's okay. We'll roll with the flow, and if we need to mute, we can mute. Let's see, Mike, can you hear us?
I hear you well.
Ooh, I feel like the voice of God just spoke to me. Man, big pipe.
That's Mike.
Wow.
Mike, is your video working? Are you able to do video?
I am not, because I'm not allowed to put cameras on my computers per work. So apologies.
That's okay. Most people listen to the show. I'd say about 3 and 4. And for those that are watching, you're just going to see Mike when he's talking.
Yeah. Just imagine a very good-looking man, and that'll be pretty accurate.
I feel like I'm listening to a movie trailer in a world.
I'm not the only one with a good voice here, Mr. Span.
No. I can't compete with that. That's awesome. I mean, forget this. You ought to be in the movie trailer business or doing voiceover work. That's awesome.
I missed my calling.
You did. I feel like I'm talking to God directly here. John, we see you, man. You're there.
How do I sound now?
Clean as a whistle. Audio good, video good. Nothing like a little reboot, little dabble, do you? So this probably is it. This is so easy getting people on this platform. I can probably start the pre-show like 5 minutes before showtime and make it all work. This is just too easy. So I was discussing our schedule. I don't know how many of you are going to be at the NWA. Kim or John, are you coming by chance?
I will be there.
Kim, are you coming?
Unfortunately, I'm not able to make it. September is just going to be busy. There are a lot of meetings. I wish I could go, but is there fun stuff on your schedule for NWA?
Well, we're doing the show live from the Ron. Monday night, 2 weeks from tonight.
Wow, so that's true.
Gosh,
we will miss you, but we'll be able to get you on with this setup here.
Oh, great. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, so that's one thing about the NWA live shots we do. You never know who walks in the shot and who's going to join us. And again, I'm hearing myself come back. And Kevin, if I mute you, that's the only reason for that is that we're hearing some artifacts come back down your channel, and you just unmute when you need to talk. The people that listen to the show, a lot of them are audio files, and they get very agitated when I do a poor job of managing audio, which is what, because I don't do audio. This is not my deal. I am not a broadcast engineer. I'm a physical science guy acting like a broadcast engineer. So.
Yeah, I apologize for that, James. We did the sound check earlier, and I was still using Hangouts to do it, and Kevin and I had some difficulty getting that arrangement to work. I got to talk to Mike for a little while, and as you can hear, his sound is pristine and wonderful. Kevin and I got to email a bit about other things for the show, but we didn't get to do his sound check. So I think this will work. And it looks like he's actually pulling out some headphones. Are those headphones you had in your hand there, Kevin?
And he's muted now.
He's muted now. He's smiling at us, and that might mean yes.
Yeah, I have some headphones, although they're very old and very large and not very current, but it will help with the feedback audio.
Wonderful.
Kevin, I am very old and very large. You have no problems with that. We're used to that on this show. So.
Very large.
Very old, very large. Not as large as I used to be. I've lost a lot of weight, but I used to be large. So we Mike and Kevin, we have to wait until 2 more minutes, 30 after the hour, for the TV side to join us, and then we'll get started and get you guys out as soon as we can. But thank you all for taking the time to come on the show.
So
exciting
current weather note. There's actually a tornado warning north of Oklahoma City right now. Yeah, there's a line of thunderstorms coming through, several severe warned. These storms had the potential to grow and potentially produce up to golf ball sized hail and 80-mile-an-hour winds or so. So we were expecting the wind-driven hail threat, but this is a bit of a surprise.
Surprise, surprise. I see that. Logan County, Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In fact, the radar scope pushed a new update out today, and when they push a new update out, automatically the radar that you see is Oklahoma City. So it's kind of cool. Came right up. So there you go. That looks like they just canceled it.
Well, there's one up by just west of Joplin too.
Yeah, that's the one I see.
Yeah, the one north of Oklahoma City looks like.
Yeah, Oklahoma City wasn't looking too good, but the one out by Columbus,
this looks
Baxter
nasty.
Springs. That looks nasty.
Goodness gracious.
What direction's that going?
Well, unfortunately, towards Joplin.
Is it? Wow. Yeah, it is. It is heading south of east. Wow.
That looks eerily familiar, doesn't it? Oy.
Uh-huh. Oh boy, yeah, that's not good.
So let's see. I have not tried the screen share thing. Let's see if I can make this happen here.
The trick is getting back out, James.
Yeah. So share and radar scope, and then share. So in theory, you should be seeing.
You got it.
That storm. And let me welcome our television viewers. You are watching let me just point out, if you're watching this in Alabama, you're looking at a severe storm with a possible tornado that is in the far northeastern corner of, is that in Kansas or Oklahoma?
Yeah, it's the far southeast corner of Kansas. About to cross the line. Right by the Oklahoma line and right by the Missouri line. It's right where all those 3 states meet.
Right. And again, you can probably see Joplin, Missouri is awfully close to this. So our friends are dealing with that. It's pretty rough. And there was an enhanced risk for that zone issued by SPC earlier today. So, yeah, let me see if I can stop the share. And I think I just did. And let me be sure. I got the Brady Bunch thing going here. Have we lost anybody? Mike, are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. I see what happens now. We go to a multiple box arrangement, and Mike is you're still there. Okay, we're good. Well, let's get this thing started. Let me turn the recorders on here, and we will shake and bake. Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, this is WeatherBrains, episode number 710 for August 26th, 2019. It's the weekly show that is all about weather. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us, either on the audio or video side this week. My name is James, and we are a little short on staff this week, but hey, we got some important people here like Dr. John Scala, the man with the hair of an angel drinking out of his Green Bay cup.
There you go.
John, how are those Packers looking in the preseason?
I think it's going to be exciting. Unfortunately, we lost one of our better wide receivers to a high ankle sprain last week, and he's going to be out 4 to 6 weeks, but I would guarantee that the play calling will be a lot more interesting this year.
Okay, there you go. Awesome. So I'm trying to think, we did football brains last week. I want to go down that rat hole again, but Dr. Kim Cloco McLean is with us from Norman, Oklahoma, and we've got some pretty nasty weather not too far from you tonight. I know we'll do weather roundup later, but goodness, we got some action here.
We do. We were expecting a line of thunderstorms to come through this evening, moving through western Oklahoma and then into the metro. And they're doing so now. There are several that are severe warned. We just had a tornado warning on one of those storms briefly. But as you pointed out at the start of the show, there's some real interest up in that storm up by Joplin, in the extreme northeast corner of Oklahoma, southeast Kansas, and southwest Missouri. So our listening audience might want to check that out, watch that as that evolves. You have that up on the screen. And that looks like a monster of a storm.
Yeah, what is this, May or August here? I mean, wow.
Yeah. Well, I tell you that the storm motion is a little bit more typical of August, but having a tornado on it isn't.
Yeah. All right. Well, Kim, let's bring in our guest. We have a very interesting topic tonight. So you introduce our friends on the show here this evening.
Sure. So I'm very pleased to bring on Dr. Kevin Ash and Dr. Mike Ignato. These are two of my more behavioral science colleagues who are working on issues, a variety of different issues about mobile home populations, manufactured home populations, people who have a different kind of situation that they might have to consider when they go to respond to tornado warnings. And welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you both. So you might recall a couple of months ago now, I guess it's been about 2 months since we had Stephen Strader and Walker Ashley on the show. Stephen had helped to assemble our entire team. So now you're getting to see sort of the other half of us. But we had a great show where we talked a little bit about some of the work that Stephen and Walker have done pertaining to the issue of tornadoes and people who live in manufactured and mobile homes. And now we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into another aspect of the group's project with Kevin and Mike. And since many people on the show haven't gotten to be introduced to you both, I'm going to start by just helping them to understand your background and what brings you to this topic. I think I'll start with Kevin, because Kevin's actually more from the area I'm in currently. He's gotten to do a great tour of a lot of places, including places across the Southeast, that helped to bring him to this topic. So Kevin, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into weather and what track you took to get you into the more social sciences as well?
I was always interested in weather and disasters. I'm not sure why growing up, but I grew up in Oklahoma, split my childhood between Tulsa area and Oklahoma City, Moore area. So we had several events that were obviously impactful and of high interest to everybody in those areas. And so I would say those were, I think if I had to trace back my intense interest in how people react and behave around severe weather, it would be 1984 when we lived in Tulsa, in April when we had the Manford tornado, and then we had another night where we had tornadoes around the Tulsa area when I was very young. And so I remember, taking shelter in the closet, getting underneath blankets and things like that, as a young child, and being highly impressed in one way and of course scared another way, right? And it leaves a big impression on young people, right? So that's where I got interested in, and we moved to the Oklahoma City area, and we lived in Moore in 1999 when the tornado happened, and we lived near Westmore, so it came through the northern half of our neighborhood. So, there was a lot of obviously a tragic event, and talking to friends and family about what they did, and talking about what we did and what information we were looking at, really got me interested in social science and behavioral science, right? And so after I started at Oklahoma, and I started in meteorology because I wasn't sure what else to do. I wasn't aware of how social scientists might approach that at first. So I started in meteorology, but quickly I met some other researchers at OU who were in geography, like Matt Biddle, who got me interested in hazards geography and looking at how people use information, make decisions, the ideas of social vulnerability. And so that's really what set me on the path where I've ended up now. So I've gone through I was at South Carolina for my PhD, where they have a research vulnerability, hazards and vulnerability research lab. And then I've been bounced around to a few places before I finally landed a position here at UF last year. So excited to be here. And yeah, I've been in the Southeast and the East Coast for most of the last 10 years now, although I was in Colorado a couple of years ago for a year. But excited to be in this part of the country and continue this work that I got interested in. I did my dissertation in South Carolina with mobile home and manufactured home populations, which we'll talk about more in a little bit.
Yeah, so thank you for that great overview. What is it that, before we get to hear a little bit of Mike's background and then what brought you two together, can you tell us a little bit about the project that you did in South Carolina? What was it in particular that you were investigating, and what kind of things did you learn there?
So we had a lot of work on social vulnerability there, and we used a lot of census data and did a lot of vulnerability mapping, where we would map physical hazard, and then we would try to use census and socioeconomic data to understand social vulnerability and how those overlap or intersect. And one of the variables that you often see is like the percentage of the housing sector that's manufactured or mobile homes. And so when we kind of look at this data in our lab and kind of go through the different variables, we noticed, of course, the South Carolina has one of the highest concentrations of manufactured homes and mobile homes in the country. And I was always interested in the tornado context and in severe storm context. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of go deeper into that particular subpopulation and look at what are some of the unique issues with risk communication and risk perception, decision making, and how does that play into the idea of vulnerability. We know that manufactured and mobile home populations in some respects have some limited resources, but especially in South Carolina and the Carolinas and in the Piedmont, the Southeast, there's a pretty wide range of socioeconomic conditions in manufactured housing, right? So all these things made it interesting to me that it would be an interesting topic to break out and look at more details and more nuance on, how do people view their own vulnerability with respect to tornadoes living in that housing sector? How often have they ever evacuated during either a watch or a warning? How disposed are they to doing so if they never have? And what are some of the issues that they see in potentially doing that behavior? What are some barriers? What are some things that they don't understand? So I found a few things. For instance, a couple of basic things, like in South Carolina, they're not quite as weather savvy as in maybe Alabama or Oklahoma, for example. And that's not putting anyone down. It's just the fact that they don't have severe thunderstorms and tornadoes as high a frequency as some of the other parts of the country. And so they don't pay attention to it quite as closely. And so, there's some basic things like not really having a great grasp on the difference between tornadoes and hurricanes and what an evacuation means and how it's different between the two hazards, right? Because a lot of people there are familiar with hurricane evacuation, and that's a very different, in their minds, that's a very structured evacuation, right? It's a very large area, whereas tornadoes, of course, are very short term. There's no official evacuation order, right? With tornadoes, it's up to the individual to decide if they want to evacuate. And so there's a lot of confusion about what evacuation even means and how to do it in a tornado context. Some of the other things that related to that were where, if they're going to evacuate, where should they go, right? And I'm sure this has come up on this show before, but that's definitely something I ran into in South Carolina, where people said, well, we don't have public shelters for tornadoes in South Carolina. There's almost no individual tornado shelters, right, for individual households. There's very few of those. So people were confused, if they're supposed to do this behavior, where should I go? Should I go to a friend's house? Should I go to some sort of public building, like a school? Should I try to go to a church nearby or something? Those were three of the big ones that came up, that people thought that either they had tried before or they thought they might try if they felt threatened enough to leave their home. And there was also a question of, if I'm going to leave, and even if I know where I'm going to go, when am I supposed to leave exactly? Again, we're sort of related to a hurricane evacuation has a bit more of a solid sort of public statement, right? That now there's an evacuation. If you're in this area and you're in these evacuation zones, this is the time you need to leave by this time if you're going to leave. And there's no specific information like that for a tornado. So I think people find it confusing in South Carolina in particular.
Kim, can I jump in here for a sec?
Please.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm curious. The people that you spoke to, are they native South Carolinians? Did you come across anyone who actually lived, say, in the plains and then moved to South Carolina?
I did. Most of the people I spoke with were native, either they were native South Carolinians or they were native to Georgia or North Carolina, had moved. So they were close by in the region. But I did talk to a few people who had lived. One woman in particular, I talked in an interview in a long.
Uh-oh.
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 Frozen in time.
This is when we bring in Mike.
Yeah. All right. Well, while we wait for Kevin's line to resolve, let's bring you in, Mike, and hear a little bit about your background and some of the work that you did before teaming up with Kevin on this issue, where you had done some work on mobile and manufactured housing populations as well. So, Mike, welcome. Oh, I think that we've duplicated Kevin's. Never seen that on the Family Feud. Brady Bunch squares.
Brady Bunch, yes.
Am I back?
Oh, well, okay. All right.
There we go.
Then let's go ahead and let you complete your thought, and then we'll get to Mike shortly. So go ahead, Kevin. I don't know where we lost you in your stream of thought, but if you want to just start
So I think where I cut out was talking about whether I ran into anyone in South Carolina who had lived elsewhere before living in South Carolina. And I definitely did. And I remember one participant in particular who grew up in the plains and was talking about, it's very different here. There's not as much information. There's not as many shelters. And so a lot of people don't really talk about it in the same way as they might in Oklahoma or Kansas, for example. So I think, there were some people who were more used to how you can deal with a tornado hazard, not necessarily how you're supposed to, but how you can in some other parts of the country. But I think they found that living in South Carolina, they noticed that the culture is just not as attentive to that particular hazard.
That is fascinating. So earlier when you mentioned that there's a confusion between hurricanes and tornadoes, is that primarily about these actions you're talking about, the more structured sort of decisions you make in a hurricane, the evacuation and so on? Or was it also about sort of phenomenological? Was it also about a confusion about, well, what is really the difference between what will happen to me in these kinds of storms versus a hurricane?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. I mean, I think to some extent, I think people occasionally slip and use one term when they mean the other, and that may not necessarily mean that in their minds that they don't understand sort of the scale differences and that type of thing. But I think that there's a lot of evidence in interviews that that there's some misunderstanding or I don't know if that's the right word, but not understanding the temporal and spatial nature of a tornado and how short and small it really is, right? Compared to basically everyone who I talked to, their sort of experience and what they anchored on was Hurricane Hugo, right? So,
Sure.
so So that it's a very different experience, right? And that coupled with the way that hurricane evacuation is managed, and it mostly being a coastal phenomenon, right? In terms of evacuation, not only, but especially a coastal phenomenon with storm surge zones. And then, so people inland, I think, were kind of perplexed sometimes about why am I supposed, I don't live in an area that evacuates for hurricanes per se, right? So why would I, sort of the idea just doesn't strike them as why do I need to do it? Why do I need to evacuate, right? And if I use a word sometimes, sometimes I got a little bit of a different response, right? So if I said go take shelter somewhere else instead of say evacuate, sometimes that made a little bit of a difference, because I think the word evacuation is so tied to hurricanes, especially in South Carolina. So.
That's a really interesting thing. I think for our listening audience, anyone who is in public safety in South Carolina, to know that there might be this issue of confusion, and they may know it as residents, that they may sense that and be part of that sort of disaster subculture. But it's an interesting thing to think about and consider, that the words that we sometimes use with respect to mobile and manufactured housing populations, I mean, that's what is in the text of the warnings. Is to evacuate, and that if you're in a more hurricane prone place, that's loaded, a very loaded term, has very specific meanings that, and in your work, it showed that might be confusing. That's fascinating. That it really speaks to the need to understand how the people in the place that you are living and the place that you're serving actually understand the messages. All right. Well, that's a great background. Thank you. Mike, let's go ahead and bring you in, and we'll go through this background with you too, and bring you up to the point right before you meet Kevin, before we get into some of the excitement of the work you guys got to do in Alabama. Tell us a little bit about your background. Now, we know that we don't actually get to see you, in part because of some of the work you do in other domains, as I understand it, more with the Department of Defense. Is that right?
Yeah. So first, hello, and thank you for having me. I would classify myself broadly as a risk and hazard researcher. And in that, we work both left and right of bang, which is to say before bad things happen and after, well, bad things are happening. And when I first came to weather, I came here from a counterterrorism Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence, which seems, I admit, not the most intuitive leap, but most of my work up until that point had focused on active killer situations. So your Virginia Techs, your Christchurches recently in New Zealand, things of that nature, sad times. But when you think about the nature of those events, you have a public with variable knowledge. You have a very rare situation that people can self-rescue to some extent by taking protective actions during. So in that sense, a lot of the work that we do on certain types of man-made hazards, be they intentional or non-intentional, really translate well to weather. And so it turned out that was actually a pretty good fit for me to come into the weather community. The nice thing about tornadoes is they do eventually tend to end on their own. Certain other situations do require a little bit more of an intervention. But it was a great space where I felt like I could help, I could make a meaningful difference in quality of life, which is always what I try to do as a risk and hazard guy. And so that was important. So the first project that I got to do with weather that brought me to Kevin was looking at the impact of false alarms. There was a thought kind of early in Vortex that maybe because there might be some sense of overwarning, and that's questioning people's ability to take all of these warnings seriously. And we looked at that for a couple of years, pulled out a bunch of findings, but the main punchline was people don't mind being overwarned, at least not in what we would consider mobile and manufactured housing and traditional stick-built housing throughout the southeastern U.S. And we predominantly focused on the Southeast as a whole for that, but then we did additional work very specifically in Alabama. And pretty interestingly, we found that people were not actually very good at determining what the false alarm rate was, and they tended to greatly overestimate the accuracy of false alarm rates in the region. So they tended to think the weather community was really not overwarning. We found that people who did perceive false alarm rates and tornado alert accuracy to be higher were also much more likely to take positive protective actions. Those are things like sheltering, being responsive to tornado warnings generally, staying away from windows, moving debris that may be damaging, things of that nature, kind of on script. So that kind of made us scratch our heads. We then tried to drill in a little bit more on the mobile and manufactured housing community. And we were very much of the opinion of Walker Ashley that these people do experience higher fatality rates than those in other types of housing. And we tried to look at maybe it had something to do with their access to resources. Maybe it had something to do with their ability to prepare, their attention, something else. And that didn't really shake out either. We found that many of these manufactured mobile home residents want to respond and try to be weather aware. They're not always spot on. A lot of them kind of mischaracterize what best protective actions to take. They don't realize that their structure may not have the same resiliency as other types of housing. But that was something that, we kind of looked at that and said, okay, what's the next logical step? And we tried seeing, well, maybe it had to do with how people received information. And it turned out most people are receiving information in multiple ways. They're getting it from their personal network. We had people refer to it as wife alert, the significant other or extended family member who keeps everybody in touch of weather. And they're trying to get some good triangulation here. So even that alerting, the timing of it could be questionable, and that kind of gets to some of your previous work. But the actual ability for these people to find information wasn't that bad. So we were kind of left scratching our heads. So the final thing we did is we tried to take a look at what is it about their core personality? Is that something that we should look at? Do people have a sense of learned helplessness? Is it something where if we're working with a vulnerable population that, just kind of the rigor of life has made them feel like they don't have a lot of agency? And, there was a little bit going on there. We found that a lot of people as a primary action do tend to engage in prayer. Prayer does not seem to relate to positive action taking, but religiosity overall did. So, and that was a very dominant force in that part of the country. So, it didn't entirely seem to be a sense of self-efficacy and agency either. And that was kind of the big rub of what we got that led me to Kevin's door. And I had the pleasure of first meeting Kevin at a Vortex SE meeting, and our eyes met across the room. It was somewhat magical, but it became it became very clear to me early on from hearing him talk that he was one of the smartest men in the room. And I said, that is someone I can learn from. That is someone I can do better with. So I went over and forced to engage Kevin in several conversations, and until he begrudgingly accepted me as a potential collaborator and friend. And that kind of catches us up to current.
Yeah, so there is so much in everything that you were just talking about. And I saw James Spann's eyes get wide at different points in all of that. This is a population I know, James, that you live with, you know well. One of the things that you were talking about in all of that, Mike, was and did I capture this correctly, that first layer, you found that the false alarm problem that everyone presumes is a problem isn't so much of a problem. And can you tell us a little bit about how you measured that? What was it that exactly you were looking at there?
Yeah, so that's a very fair point. What we did is we did a mixed methods approach. We deployed 4 surveys, each of about 1,000 participants, and we tried to split that as evenly as we could. We couldn't get quite as many mobile and manufactured housing residents across the southeastern U.S., and that is a broad definition when we say southeastern for the survey. We were looking basically from Mississippi over to Florida and from the Carolinas down. So, we were getting a little bit more of a geographic dispersion, touching some of the regions Kevin worked in. And we tried to focus as much as we could on Mississippi, Alabama, and to some extent Florida, because that was where we had the best luck accessing people in that type of housing. So we had that kind of quantitative, traditional, large-scale survey element, and we tried to balance that as best as we could by the census demographics available. We tried to balance for age, gender, income in those populations. Kind of like anytime you do something big scale. And the other thing we did is we went down, we did a bunch of focus group testing. We tried to focus on those in all of the regions, particularly in Alabama. We did some work in Louisville, Kentucky, and we did some work in the Carolinas. And we just tried to sit down and talk to people, hear their stories and hear their truths about their experiences with weather. And we didn't get any disconfirmations. We didn't get that at any point that those weather alerts and the potential for false alarms was problematic. But I say that with this caveat. One of the things that I think has plagued a lot of this work that we'll talk about in a few minutes is we tend to think of manufactured and mobile home residents broadly as a monolith. And I think the more work that we've done, the work Kevin did independent of us, the work I did independent of him, and the work we've done collaboratively, we see that that is a whole mosaic of communities. And I'm not sure we've accessed all of them to know that we can say across the board it's not an issue. But we can say with the groups we've worked with that that concern for false alarm is not as prevalent as originally thought. And largely, I actually would say it's not a problem.
Was this a written or a verbal data that you were? How did you go about this? What's the technique of gathering this data?
Sure. So the survey component was a written element. And what we did is we worked across the country with several different major survey agencies that said they could provide us populations of mobile and manufactured home residents. And the way we defined that was very much that they focus on either individual site mobile and manufactured homes, mobile home parks, manufactured housing parks, and communities, and things of that nature. So kind of your single and double wide communities. The focus groups were all spoken in person. And we actually got to be in your backyard for some of that, James, because we were in Tuscaloosa. And when we did those collections, we were at the University of Alabama Tuscaloosa campus working with a few faculty there. And that was great. I would like to thank Darren Griffin, who may or may not ever hear this, for his great effort in driving to mobile home parks and getting chased away several times armed for getting us some participants.
So I guess it's just staggering to me because understand in 2011, the FAR here was 83,
Yep.
83. That's not acceptable to me.
Yeah.
And I guarantee I'll find you some people that will say, I hear these warnings all the time and nothing ever happens. It's interesting that we're specifically talking about mobile home or manufactured home residents here, that's not a big deal. I'm afraid that the Weather Enterprise would hear that and, well, let's just keep pressing that button every time. The easiest thing to do in that office is just to press the tornado warning button because your POD will just be fantastic. And
I think
guys, I hate to break into an amazing conversation. This is wonderful. Just want to give you a quick update on my side. There appears to be an area of rotation that is diving through the north suburbs of Oklahoma City and kind of heading my way. So my husband is frantically signaling to me to pay attention to this. If I do have to go, I'll just let you know, and we can hand this off to John and James' capable hands. But do know that if I do just fall off, it's to do with the weather. It's not anything to do with the company or the conversation. Just wanted you to know.
Please be safe. James, I think that's a great point, but I think where this goes a little bit of a divergence is looking at outcomes. When we talk about these communities being attentive and wanting to take protective actions, and this kind of forwards the conversation to Kevin and I's current work, these people want to do the right thing. That doesn't mean they're doing the right thing. And, without kind of stirring the pot too much and getting ahead of ourselves, just because they wanted to execute proper actions does not mean that they were resourced or in a position to do so. So I think we're still seeing that it looks like a FAR problem, because people aren't always responding the way we would intend. But a lot of times, either access to resources in terms of what we'd think of as physical capital, running vehicles, place to go, something within a reasonable distance, are not the only barriers that we're seeing. We're seeing other barriers that have to do with kind of social and professional limitations. And that's something that I think is pretty interesting and something that needs to be explored much further in the upcoming years.
All right, so that's really great background on some of the work that you were doing and some of the challenging kinds of questions you were asking, and the rabbit trail that led you to try to learn more and more about this population, because you were learning some things that didn't necessarily fit a priori expectations, what everyone thought was going on the surface.
Absolutely.
So let's bring us to the point where you and Kevin started to collaborate, and what it was that you decided to do. What kinds of questions were you looking to ask as you try to get in more depth on this population?
Sure. Kevin, you want me to do it or you want to take it?
I can start with one thing. One thing that I found in South Carolina, and I sort of saw hints of it in the data, was, and we've kind of touched on this, was this idea that residents who live in some of the larger and newer manufactured homes, double wides, newer units, tended to some extent to not feel that they needed to evacuate. And so I wanted to explore that a little bit more. And when I met Mike at Vortex, and when Steven Strader and Walker and Kim started putting the team together, that was one thing we wanted to dig into a little bit more, which is why we also have David Ruesch from Auburn, who's an engineer, a wind engineer on the team. And so we've looked a little bit more into mobile home resident and manufactured home resident perception of the quality of their home and the ability to withstand wind and debris. And so we're still working out some of the details on that, but we collected a bit more data, and we do see in the data from Alabama and Mississippi and the survey data that we have, we do see that there's a bit of a paradox still, where those who live in nicer, newer, larger homes, while they may have the ability to evacuate to a sturdy building somewhere else in good time, they tend not to feel that that's necessary. Whereas those people who do live in older or less reliable or less safe units, they would like to evacuate, but those are the populations who tend to have a variety of other limitations, personal mobility limitations, lack of access to vehicles, all kinds of other intersecting vulnerabilities and barriers. And so there's sort of it sort of takes the idea of a monolith, right? And this is one way in which you can break that out and say, we have a fundamental problem of risk perception on one hand with people who could evacuate but don't, and then you have a fundamental social vulnerability problem on the other hand with people who know and who want to evacuate if they can, but they often can't. And I think Mike hinted at that earlier. And so that's one thing that we definitely wanted to dig in more after we met and talked, and we do have some more work that we're going through now on that angle. I don't know, Mike, do you have any other?
I think you absolutely characterized it well. We were very interested in that perceptions of your personal housing stability. We were interested in this idea of maybe there's a strong sense of community that's preventing people from wanting to evacuate. Maybe they have local relations or people with functional access needs that they feel obligation to care for. We looked at things like information access. What is these people's ability to access timely information? We had this sense before that they could receive triangulation, but we didn't know if the timing of that, if they only have a couple minutes before the storm arrives, that their ability to act on it is limited. We tried to see what types of actions they would take if they knew where some of their local shelters were. We looked at their resources, what they had on hand, and when we say that, we define it as, physical things. Do you have access to transportation that's reliable? But we also looked at social and professional things, and this is getting what we were discussing earlier. We found a lot of people didn't feel comfortable missing a day of work. There was the potential for a storm that could harm them. There was the guarantee that not making rent if you didn't get enough hours. And that's a very interesting economic question that I don't think a lot of work had fully investigated. And those are kind of some of the things that we looked at. We also looked at people's comfort with risk. A lot of research historically has found that, financial comfort is related to risk aversion. People with more wealth tend to be a little bit more willing to spend that to preserve life, whereas people who may be more financially compromised are more comfortable with a high level of risk. And that was kind of how we approached this, to kind of look at what might be feeding into people's decisions and their ability to act on them.
So and Kim, you might have to
Yeah, I think
head
she
for the
should.
hole here.
Yeah, I apologize, guys. I was just in our chat, our internal chat here, talking to everybody about our situation. That area of rotation is looking pretty solid, and at least pretty worrisome. I hear my husband in the room next to me. He's preparing our storm shelter. So I'm sure that I need to go do something in the interest of our whole conversation here
Yes.
about preparing and responding and all the things that we'd hope people would do with tornado warnings. So I'm really sorry to bugger out a little bit early here, but you have the beautiful melodic voice of Mike to keep you company. And I know he's made me feel just safer listening to him and his beautiful, beautiful tones. And Kevin and all of his wisdom. So I hope you all have.
So
a
Kim, are
great
you
show.
actually in the Polygon here?
So that's interestingly enough, I'm not. I'm south of it. So this is going through the north side of Oklahoma City. Actually, it's my sister lived up there not too long ago. But this, as we're speaking of areas of different sociodemographics, this is actually one of the better off areas of the Oklahoma City metro. The area of rotation is pointed straight toward downtown Oklahoma City, though, and that would have a very different exposure profile. I'm much as it gets closer to the city, I'm getting more concerned for those folks, if even just for the straight line wind threat and wind driven hail. It's not uncommon now in Oklahoma City to have a lot of people out and about, and I really, really hope that they're taking note of this and getting inside, because they don't have a whole lot of time. This is going very quickly. You can see the Weather Service has taken the big severe box approach ahead of the storm, and I think that's great to try to get people a little bit of time ahead of the arrival phase. I am just south of that Oklahoma City dot. So if you were to scroll down a little bit, just south of Moore, I think Moore is the southernmost city you're showing on your map right now. I'm just south of Moore. So
yeah, and they just dropped a tornado warning, but I agree that the wind velocities coming off the Doppler data are just extreme here. That doesn't look good. Even with tornado warning, I'd want to be in a good safe place away from windows.
There's a second circulation there that's heading into that corner of the warning area towards War Acres. That's the one that I think is even more disconcerting than the one that the tornado warning was dropped on.
Yeah, I've been looking at that too and was wondering what you guys might think about it. That
looks like downburst action to me.
Yeah, it sure does. That has some pretty strong damage potential. As these two areas come together, that could be particularly worrisome as well. And I'm not really sure how that bodes for Norman, to be honest. I guess for the moment, I'm going to just kind of keep an eye on this and go offline a little bit. I hope to be able to rejoin you guys in a couple of minutes, but I'm for the moment going to go help with household preparedness and baby preparedness.
Yep, you do the right thing. We'll see in a little bit, Kim, if you can make it. Again, we're seeing 70 mile per hour winds at the beam is at 1,900 feet. So again, that's a pretty rough ride here. So let me stop the radar here, and we'll get back to the topic at hand. Nothing like being interrupted by weather on this show, which is always interesting. And
There's a
again,
rarity.
we'll get Kim back. But so Kevin and Mike, I am a practitioner, and I've been in this state. I was born here. I will die here. I'll be buried here. I've lived here all my life except for 2 years. It is one of my greatest struggles. It is one of the greatest frustrations. And number one, thank you for this work, because in order to be more successful in mitigating loss of life for people that live in manufactured housing, we need data. We need hard facts, and not what do you think, or guessing, or things like that. So I guess I want to jump to kind of maybe to some of the conclusions. We had 23 people that died down here back in March in Lee County. And again, that's not in my TV market, but it's awfully close. And over the years, I've been doing this 41 years, over and over and over and over, we have loss of life. So I guess, and let me just ask you this before we get to conclusions. There has been a campaign within the, what's the best way I can say this? Those that are maybe representing manufactured housing entities, trying to tell the public that to some degree you might have a choice of staying there, that these things are safe. Is there any confusion, you think, from some of these new messages that we're hearing from MHI and some of these other people?
I would be happy to speak for myself and not as a representative of anyone else. And I would say that, yeah, there's a problem, and that pushing those messages, when we look at how people are living in these homes, what is actually happening to them as storms roll through, that it's a problem. And, you know, we've always heard the difference that, well, you know, mobile homes were prior to XY date, and now it's all manufactured homes, and they're made to this higher standard. And the truth is, I don't believe, from the things I've learned working with this team and working in this area, that it makes a difference to the people who are in the path, who are injured or killed, if their home was made prior to or post 1974, whatever it was. Those people are still paying an extremely high cost in terms of injury and loss of life. And no, I don't feel like their messaging is fair, appropriate, or you know, ethical.
That, you know, we were being lectured at the NWA annual meeting last year that we were being discriminatory against mobile homes. And I told these people, I'm your advocate. It is wonderful, affordable housing.
Yeah.
I'm your biggest advocate. But it's like cars. You can't be in a car during a tornado, and you can't be in a manufactured home during a tornado, even if it was built 2 years ago. And people are hearing these messages and they think, well, I'm just fine. Because I saw some guy on TV that said, hey, you know, if your mobile home is new, then you're okay. And I have great concern about that as well. And we are trying to offset that. But there's some powerful forces fighting the messaging that we're trying to present. But after all this is said and done, Kevin and Mike, you're talking to me, and you're talking to practitioners. What's your top 3 bits of advice for us after all this data's come in?
Kevin, you mind if I start us off?
Sure.
So to echo your previous sentiment, one, I would never advise people not live in mobile homes. I would never want to remove affordable housing as an option from anyone. But I think, exactly like you were saying, they are not weather ready for all events. And promoting awareness of their limitations is not a prohibition or a limitation on their availability in housing stock. Is a reasonable option for people to live in and raise families. But when I would say some of our major findings is, not only is manufactured and mobile housing not a monolith, it divides across a number of social, geographic, and community lines. When we see geographic dispersion of mobile homes, we see them in both urban mobile home parks, suburban mobile home parks, and rural, individual, and small communities. So we have this concept that there's a geographic dispersion issue, and each of these people have different needs. Your rural residents, their probability of losing power, cell phone reception, television reception, etc. Maybe they have spotty radio to begin with, which is some of the things we heard. They might not have access to siren service. they have a different need in terms of timing of warning than the suburban or urban part. The other thing we saw was in terms of community. We noticed a lot of very financially stable, blue collar, wonderful working families. And what they would do is they would put a number of mobile home units on the family member's property with a traditional stick-built home, and they would form their own little micro community, and they tended to pool resources, and sometimes even put in their own shelters, or they had access to the basement in the main house. They didn't have as many of the issues as some of the other groups because they had financial means. So we saw this kind of different divide between, sometimes people think mobile and manufactured housing stock focuses only on socioeconomically lower groups, and that wasn't the case either. And the final thing we saw is that in terms of community origin and professionalism is some of these communities are just they're just people who work oftentimes in semi-skilled or trade labor markets, and sometimes they're transient labor, and there's a lot of access needs in terms of language and hesitation of working with people who may appear to be representative of local or federal government that created some hesitation to engaging with us. I'm a fairly full-figured gentleman, and when Kevin and I walk into some of these parks, we looked like government. And some of the places we walked into, people turned away or went inside, and I think it wasn't out of malice, but it was out of concern for what we may do to their community. So even though we're just trying to make people weather aware, I think we have to be really mindful of the different types of communities that break down, both in terms of income, in terms of geography, in terms of their ability to receive information based on language. And that would be what I would say was some of our major takeaways, is that this is an extremely multifaceted group.
Kevin, what say you?
So I would say a couple of things. I would say the first thing is the tone of how the Weather Enterprise addresses this problem, both in short-term communications, in crisis situations, but also in the long term, right? As we just talk about it like this, I think it's really important to always carry a tone of care and trying to empower people, right? So one thing that I've sort of run into a little bit in interviews and being out and about with manufactured mobile homes is, people feel like they're stigmatized on multiple levels. And to some people, this feels like just another brick in the wall on the level of stigmatization, right? And being told, you live in a quote unquote substandard house or something like that, right? And while there is some truth to that in some ways, people, not everybody who lives in mobile home or manufactured home lives there because they couldn't afford something else. They chose to live there, right? Maybe they, for various reasons, right? So I think we have to be careful in the Weather Enterprise not to talk about this in a way that makes people feel singled out and stigmatized personally. Now, I'm not talking about the industry so much. You mentioned that the industry was complaining. The industry can handle itself, but I think in terms of individuals and households, we definitely don't want them to feel like they're being singled out or stigmatized, but that people are just trying to empower and help them to remain safe, right? And I think in large part, the Weather Enterprise is doing a good job of that. I see, like everybody else, I see some of the coverage on the internet nowadays, since so many, people stream live. I see television coverage and NWS on Twitter, and I do see a lot of really well-crafted messaging coming out now for manufactured and mobile homes. So the second part of that is it has to be a much longer communication about what people can do and when, in order to empower people to try to make these decisions, right? Because once you're under a warning, it's a bad idea to try to get out and go somewhere for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. For anyone who has, a shelter, their neighbor has a shelter, or something like that, then of course they can maybe, head out even when they're under the warning and go next door. But for a lot of people, like when I did the work in South Carolina, the average driving distance people had for their preferred destination, if they were going to evacuate for tornado, was 10 to 15 minutes, right? Which is about the average warning lead time, right? So inherently there's a problem there. And so again, this is something I've seen in the weather enterprise is really improving in the last few years. And that's trying to give people, well ahead as an event is forecast potentially, in a particular area, starting to let people know early on to think about, okay, where are you going to be on that day? Where are you going to be, a couple of hours before we expect the storms? Where are you going to be an hour before we expect the storms in your area? Are you going to be able to, leverage your social networks, your friends, your family, your neighbors, to help you be in a safer place if that's what you want to do and that's what you feel like you need to do. So I would say that's my two big things. Is just making sure the tone, especially in terms of the public, is always encouraging and positive, and making sure that the communication is always leading up to event and during the event, giving people options, getting them thinking about it ahead of time. And like I said, I definitely do see both of those happening. So it's really encouraging.
So here's a problem, guys. So, you've got, let's say, somebody that lives in a manufactured home and they're in a fairly rural area and the community shelter is maybe 10 miles away. They say, when do I need to take my family to the shelter?
Yep.
And typically it's triggered by some type of message from the weather enterprise. Maybe it's a tornado watch. Maybe it's a tornado warning. Maybe it's a phone call from a neighbor that saw something. I've always struggled with that because understand, if you send people to a tornado shelter, every time there's a tornado watch, odds of any one spot being hit by a tornado are tiny, and you're going to be sitting in a really cramped space with some people that might not have good personal hygiene for 6 hours. And if you've got kids, they can't handle it. You can't handle it. How do you address that? And do we need to come up with a new intermediate product in the weather enterprise, somewhere between a watch and a warning? What do you guys think?
I wrote about that in one of the papers that I published, and I agree. I think that for this particular subpopulation and the behaviors that we're often recommending in the weather enterprise, I think that there is a potential need for some sort of intermediate product. I don't know what that would be exactly. I don't know if probabilistic hazard information like the NSSL is working on might be something that could be used for that, to be sort of in between the warning timescale and the watch timescale. But I totally agree with you. And one thing I will note, from a data perspective, from the data we've collected in South Carolina, when I asked people, so I asked the participants in a survey, this was about 220 residents near Columbia, South Carolina. And I gave them, sort of a hypothetical, if you only had 5 minutes, if you had 15, or if you had 45 minutes, would you be inclined to evacuate somewhere else? And of course, as you increase from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, people are much more likely to do it, right? But as you increase to 45 minutes, it flattens out, right? And so this is one of the things that I know is talked about a lot, about lead time. And yeah, once you get past 15 to 20 minutes or so, there's all kinds of uncertainty. There's all kinds of issues. People don't want to be sitting in a crowded shelter for any longer than they have to, right? So I agree, though. I agree that and I don't know what it would be, but I think there's room for an intermediate product of some kind, or something we could look into, and see. And of course, the longer you go out, the more you have the chance of somebody taking action based on that, and it doesn't pan out in the way that you thought it would, at 45 minutes or an hour. But that's something that we need more work on, from both the social side, and I guess from the warning and the weather service and the physical science side.
To build off what Kevin's saying there, I wish we had a travel ready. I don't know if we call it a high alert. I don't know what we call it there, but in terms of, it's not getting people to wait in the shelters, and Kevin, chime in if you think I'm mischaracterizing. When we spoke to a lot of people, there was a process of preparation before they could leave to get to these mobile homes. So even when we told them, if their shelter was 10 or 15 minutes away, there may be a 10 or 15 minute process in collecting a family member with mobility needs. There may be getting the kids together, getting phones charged, getting, helmets or shoes, or, maybe a little bit of food and water on hand. I think even if we just started making communities aware to start, as the weather is progressing, you need to be travel ready. The vehicle or ride needs to be staged. Your family needs to be together. And, if this does in turn accelerate into a critical event, you need to be ready to leave as soon as for a shelter as soon as notified. And I think just even that staging could maybe not as a formal product, but just as a practitioner practice could help.
And I will say too, on the intermediate message, I think these MCDs are going in a direction that might offer that. From SPC. They are darn good. The MCDs that came out on the Lee County Tornado Day, you saw, I'm sure everybody in the room here saw those. And I think my friends understand how useful they are. We have had conversations privately and in other ways about this, and they are darn good. And that something might morph out of those MCDs. And Kim, welcome back. I see you're back on the show.
Hi, everybody.
Evaluating risk.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. I heard, I think my ears were burning. I heard probabilistic hazard information mentioned and lead time preferences, and I had to come back. So far, things are looking a little bit better for Norman, and the storm complex is collapsing just a little bit in such a way that we might get sideswiped or potentially missed. But those two little areas that had shown some rotation earlier have merged, and there are some very intense straight line winds up in the northern part of Oklahoma City right now, the northern suburbs. So certainly something to keep watching for much of the metro. It's a wild night. There's another tornado warning, by the way, up near Tulsa now, the Tulsa suburbs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and again near Joplin. So this line of storms, nothing to mess with. But interesting, you guys were talking about lead time, right? I took those preparedness actions well before the warning would have been in effect for my area. It was in the, sort of half hour to 45 minutes before that would have taken place arena. And this is for all of us who are studying lead time and how time is used. This is something that we see, that people have sort of a staging time where they'd like to target, getting things together. There really is a gap, though, in weather service products in that time arena. And this is something that maybe FEE can fill. Maybe it's something a little bit more like the Storm Prediction Center's product, that really, really refined mesoscale discussion. As we continue to develop our storm scale modeling capabilities with especially the ensembles that are being generated and ensembles of ensembles. And we're starting to get a better glimpse into that short-term future, the next couple hours. The innovation that's possible in that arena is just really vast. And I think on the development side, we're almost overwhelmed by it. Not that anyone at the lab would say that they feel overwhelmed walking into the building every day, but that there's so much possibility in what could be produced and put into operations that I'm not sure what path will ultimately be followed. I can say, Mike, to what you were just talking about, the potential to have some sort of notification in the maybe hour ahead of time, and then something else when things change markedly, like something else like the warning of today, might be a nice way to do it. Have a two-staged, two-tier approach. We have a lot of geo-targeted devices now. I learned that weather radios actually have had geo-targeting technology available since 1999. We just haven't had the dissemination capabilities to really capitalize on that. We were having a workshop just this past week at the lab about the potential to take warnings and just put them in motion. It's called threats in motion. And it sounds really logical, just having warnings follow the storms. But from the perspective of disseminators, they have a lot of questions. Well, when do we start to sound the sirens? When do we start to set off the weather radios and so on? And that actually was one of the ideas that was floated. Maybe we could have a beep or some sort of alert that signals something's entering your area, get ready. and then another that says it's very close, which corresponds more to around the times that most people are taking shelter, and not just preparing to take shelter. The sheltering process itself can take quite a bit of time. It's not that people spend all their time in their shelter, and we shouldn't feel dismayed that they don't. It's really a waste of most people's time to do such a thing. But if you do what I just did and you have everything staged, you can keep an eye on it, be perfectly safe and ready to go should the need arise. So I think you guys, barring hearing all the discussion that you just had, I know that this started about mobile home populations, but I think that this is really salient to everyone who potentially faces tornado threat.
Hey, Mike and Kevin, what is the primary method in which people that live in manufactured housing receive a tornado warning?
So there was several, and if you'll allow me 1 second to bring up my data, I will give you the numbers on that.
Good. I would love to know this. This is great information. Again, I'm a data guy, and you can't make decisions without decent data. Although I do hang out in Dollar Generals. I am a Dollar General guy. I'm going to Greenville, Alabama tomorrow, and I'm going to the Dollar General, and I'm going to talk with some people. And you talk with them and you learn things, but that's not the same as what all of you do here in the research community. So, but I would love to know what is the primary method, that residents in manufactured homes are using to receive a tornado warning. Maybe not necessarily in my state, but countrywide, whatever. Just curious.
Are you talking while they're at home? Because the one thing we did find is that their access to information depends on if they're at work, if they're at school, or if they're home.
This is if they're at home. I want to know if they are in that manufactured home, in that trailer. And again, people say you shouldn't use the word trailer, and I understand you have to be sensitive to those that live in them, but that's what they call them. You go to most counties in my DMA out in rural areas, they call them trailers. It's not a negative term. It's just the way people talk here, and that's the way I talk. So, but they are home in their trailer, manufactured home, whatever. What's the main way they use to receive a tornado warning?
Give me a second. I'm reading through our paper.
Oh, this is great.
Look at you. You stumped the scientist, James.
I don't.
No, they've got the data. They just got to dig through there and find it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in the South Carolina, I don't know what the exact number is, but it was still television in South Carolina, but mobile phone and the internet was coming up, but it was still television was more than 50%.
And I wonder what is the weather radio penetration in manufactured homes? And I would love to know in my state, what percentage of those that live in manufactured homes have a NOAA weather radio in that home? By law, they have to have a smoke alarm. But if you live in my state long enough, you're going to have more close encounters with tornadoes than fires. And in my opinion, the use is very low here, despite this is a very tornado-prone part of the world. And I will say it's very discouraging to me that it's like that. And I do understand the other problem. You've got a lot of families that cannot afford a $30 weather radio. It's cost prohibitive for them. So, but again, that's a number I would love to know.
One of the things, while I'm bringing this up, we wanted to do as a future step as an embedded experiment was to give people the cash equivalent or a weather radio to see if there was a preference, if they perceived additional value in having the radio over just the cash. So that's something that we were trying to get ready to deploy.
While Mike's trying to look at his data or find his data, let me share something, a picture that I took during a damage survey a few years ago. And this was a very small mobile home park that was struck by an EF1 tornado. So I did the damage survey on this, and I remember this mobile home actually was rolled, and it was actually tied down, and the wind got underneath it, snapped the straps, and rolled it actually right on a vehicle that was parked behind it. So after we were doing the damage survey, a gentleman came up to me and asked, well, what should I do in events like this? When a tornado watch is issued, do I spend the next 3 to 5 hours in a shelter somewhere? When do I leave my home? It's a very difficult question. And I think after the fact, if we were to ask the individual who lived in this a manufactured home, his risk tolerance now is much lower than it was before the storm. So he's going to leave a lot quicker, and he's probably going to spend 3 hours in a shelter. But for someone who was not impacted, like look at these structures just to the right of this rolled mobile home. No damage there at all. Their risk tolerance hasn't been impacted. So I think the idea of risk tolerance and risk acceptance is not a level playing field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the challenges in disseminating information to evoke a timely and effective means of avoiding the threat. Not everybody will react the same way because their history is not the same.
Yeah, put my cards on the table here on this issue. I think this is why we need to move toward a system where the probabilities are given in some way, because everyone has a different risk tolerance. And so there may be some people who only want to take protective action when the certainty that there is that hazard reaches a certain threshold, and you have a very high one. There may be some people who are a little bit less risk tolerant, and they'll be more willing to look at something like a plume of probabilities heading their way and say, all right, I'm in a 20% area, but I see upstream of that, it goes up, a little bit higher, and that's just too much for me to take. And then they have the time and they have the level of confidence that they need to make that decision. Now, we don't, the studies that have shown that this is beneficial are all pretty experimental. We don't have a really good sense for this particular population, how probabilities will play into their decision making. And we don't know when it hits the real world, it could be different. It could feel different than for people who are seeing this in an experimental condition. Experiments have revealed that people are better off having this information, and they're able to make sort of the better decisions that we set up for them to make in the experiment. That's pretty big limitation though. In the real world, do people have something as well defined as a cost loss, scenario where they know there's a probability threshold where they need to take shelter? That's a little bit harder to get at. It might not be quite that simple. They might not be able to say as straightforwardly. It might be more of a gut level thing. So all that to say, John, I think you're hitting on something that's really important. There's no single unified preference for lead time. There's no single unified preference for certainty. The Weather Service does the best they can right now with what they have to issue warnings they think will do good things for people. But without a little bit better sense for, what might be an alternative, I feel like we have to give people all the information and let them choose based on how risk tolerant or intolerant they are. I don't think that's a decision the government should make for people. This is when you're at risk, and this is when you should be responding. I don't think that's actually something we can do for everyone or should do. Put out a provocative statement for the panel. I don't know if Kevin or Mike, if you have thoughts on that.
To chime back in quickly and address James's question with data, traditional media, predominantly television, is how half of people, specifically in mobile homes, become aware. And they say the source of that is what they consider to be their local meteorologist. That is closely followed by mobile devices, and that includes either social media, texts from family, or WEAs, and that does account for about 40%. So the vast majority of people are finding out from either television or through a social media via mobile device access from the data that we had collected. The majority of that being from what they consider to be their local meteorologist. And then the next largest group would be personal connections, friends, neighbors, parents, significant others.
Yeah, we've learned that's crucial. These people that are our evangelists that act on our behalf to call or text their friends and their neighbors that don't pay attention. I have learned over the years that is just crucial, but that is great information. Any data on weather radio use among those that live in manufactured homes?
I have none. Kevin, do you have any?
I did. I asked in my dissertation in South Carolina, I asked a question about how likely or unlikely residents would be among a lot of other media options and communication options. And weather radio was about almost 70% said that they were either unlikely or very unlikely to get a warning via weather radio, and only about 30% said that they were likely or very likely to get a warning via weather radio.
Wow.
That's a real problem. And the other problem is NOAA, the National Weather Service, going to continue this service in 10 years? That they have not upgraded the weather radio system to storm-based warnings. And goodness, what do you do when facets kicks in here? I think it's a marvelous service that's critical, and it's not tied into the cellular networks. It is a separate RF system that works independently of cell networks, and I think it's very important. But that's staggering how most people aren't even interested.
Yeah.
Where the truth is, if you've got a raging storm at 4 a.m.,
right.
There's a good chance, a phone call might not wake you up. But let me tell you what, you've got one of those Midland weather radios in your bedroom. Yeah. That sucker's going to wake you up. And I wish we had more people that had them. But again, we can preach and scream, and only so much we can do.
Well, part of it might be what you guys are honing in on, that maybe the system just really needs to get modernized to be useful. Right now, maybe what we're seeing is consumer preferences are telling us it's not as useful. It doesn't work with decision making the same way as this does. And if you have an app that will wake you, then you're in pretty good shape. A similar shape to what weather radio could give you, but more geo-targeted. I think there's every potential for the Weather Service to continue this service if there's a modernization done. And like you're saying, it does fill a gap that no matter what goes down, cell tower goes down, or there's just a disruption because there's so many people on their phones, and alerts start to get jammed, the weather radio will work. And I think it'll always serve a vital role. So I would hope to see that. I would really hope to see that improve, and then those numbers improve.
And I have a question also from the data, guys, and I hate to keep asking questions, but I've got to go do the news here in a second. What was the average distance from a manufactured home resident and a storm shelter, a community shelter, a safe place? How long, the distance and the time that it would involve to get there?
From my study in South Carolina, there are very few shelters, public shelters in South Carolina for tornadoes specifically. Obviously in the coastal areas, they have hurricane shelters. So really the answer specifically about tornado shelters, public shelters, is basically there are none. In terms of the distance to the places that they might go as an alternative, I have the time written down. I don't have the distance. I have the time estimates, which was the average was about 10 to 12 minutes. Or there were some outliers more in the 20 to 30 minute, and of course there were several in the sort of 5 to 10 minute range. But it was about 10 to 15 minutes driving to get to whatever they thought might be the most reasonable and accessible option for them, which was most often either a permanent home of a friend or relative, a church, or a school. Now, all of those things are problematic in different ways also, but because they're not necessarily appropriate as tornado shelters as a public option. But that's the data I had. It was about 10 to 12 or 15 minutes on average.
And then that's about our average lead time. That's one of our biggest problems, is that I can't guarantee 10, 15 minutes lead time. You might get 2 if you're lucky sometimes. So that's one of our challenges. But I hate to do this. We have to stop for just a second. I'm going to play Tony Rice and his astronomy report this week. And we'll come back, and John and Kim, y'all carry on as long as you want to here, because this is a fascinating discussion. So let's take a very quick break for Tony Rice, and we will be right back as WeatherBrains rolls along.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
Things are just a little quieter across the halls of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, this week and next. The rover drivers, geologists, engineers, and planetary scientists alike have had this time circled on their calendar for about 2 years. They use it as a time to catch up on office work, and take a well-earned vacation. Mars solar conjunction. A solar conjunction occurs when planets are on opposite sides of the sun. This will occur on Monday, September 2nd at 11 a.m. UTC. So why is JPL standing down its Mars operations for about 2 weeks? NASA places a command moratorium while Mars is within 2 degrees of the sun. Data going to and from spacecraft can get garbled as it passes through the hot ionized gas in the sun's corona. While data sent back to Earth can generally be resent if necessary, a risk of corrupting commands going to our deep space robotic explorers is just too great. 6 orbiters, including 1 European and an Indian mission, a lander, and a rover, will be offline from August 28th through September 7th. This last happened in late July 2017, and it'll happen again in early October 2021. During this command moratorium, Curiosity will stop driving, InSight will not move its robotic arm, and any instruments that generate large amounts of data, like cameras, will be inactive. Some instruments will remain active, and anything that's collected during this period will be beamed back to Earth once the conjunction is over. Elsewhere in the sky, Friday's new moon is also known as a super black moon. While it's not anything worth setting your alarm for to go out and see, new moons are lost in the sun's glare, this one occurs at an interesting time. It's being called a black moon because it's the second new moon of the month, a calendrical coincidence. But it also occurs within just 5 hours of perigee, the closest point in the moon's orbit, giving it the black supermoon title. Adjectives aside, this sets up a situation that could create some coastal flooding. The tides are, of course, created by gravitational interaction between the moon and sun. High tides are at their highest around new and full moons as the sun, moon, and Earth line up, increasing that gravitational attraction. The moon is about 25,000 miles closer at perigee versus apogee, its furthest point. And as Newton taught us, gravitational forces increase as 2 objects get closer, and that creates a bigger tidal bulge and higher tides. Now, in most cases, this only adds a couple of inches to the high tide. This can create some coastal flooding in especially low-lying areas, but if combined with strong onshore winds or a storm, these perigean spring tides can contribute to more major flooding. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
All right. Well, John, I don't know if you want to carry on the conversation from before. We are actually about to get slammed by the storms. That fortunately it looks okay, but in terms of the tornado threat is certainly not a big deal. But I might still have to sign off before you just hear wind and hail banging on the windows behind me. So would you like to carry the show home and do the picks of the week?
Sure, we can do that. We want to end here by 11 o'clock in the East. Some of us do need to get up early in the morning. 11 o'clock makes it pretty late. So are you guys, Mike and Kevin, are you familiar with picks of the week that we do?
Vaguely.
Vaguely.
I am not at all.
Not at all. So we're springing this on you at the last minute. What we typically do on this program is we ask for a link to a weather-related article, picture, event, you name it, that's got some kind of connection to what we do on this program every week. And I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to think about that. Kim and I can go first and give you a flavor of what this sounds like. Kim?
If James was here, I'd get the foghorn. Actually, I'm going to be a terrible example. I fail to have a pick. So
okay.
Yeah. Do you have a pick? Have you been better than me?
I actually do have a pick. I do. And
great.
This is an article that appeared in that well-known meteorological journal called National Geographic. But there was an interesting article that appeared recently about record-breaking lightning, both in terms of its length and its overall size. Now, I don't know how long we've been keeping track of lightning from this perspective. I know that we haven't been watching it from space all that long, but there has been some lightning identified by satellite the size of the state of Kansas, which is rather amusing. So that pick of the week will be on our picks on the webpage. So for anyone who wants to take a look at that article, it'll be on here. So now, guys, Kevin, Mike, I'll throw this out to you. Any ideas
You know what? I'll buy you guys just a minute. I do have a pick based on
Okay.
news
Kim.
of the day. I thought that I would highlight the Hurricane Research Division of AOML, the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory. They have a frequently asked questions page. And on that page, there's a question, why don't we try to destroy tropical cyclones by nuking them? This question, it turns out, is not asked infrequently, and it's been in the news today. So I will direct everyone to this really fantastic explainer by AOML.
Excellent. There was actually a field program designed about 40 years ago, I think, called Project Storm Fury. And the idea was to disrupt tropical circulations by firing rockets into them. So these ideas have been around for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, can you give us a quick explainer in your own words then? What happened? Why do we not do that?
A rocket is a pinprick, right, on the skin of a hurricane. There's no way you're going to disrupt the circulation that's 300, 400 miles across by sending a rocket into it. But we try anyway.
Right? It's the scale of forces. And you know, people on this show may be aware, but just a single supercell thunderstorm has a relatively similar energy level to that exploded by a bomb. And that's one single storm. Think about the hurricane and its magnitude. So it would be a blip. It'd be an irritant maybe, but and especially a nuclear bomb, then all that nuclear material would just wash ashore and distribute across the atmosphere. And that's a bad idea for the same reasons that trying to throw nuclear waste out to space is a bad idea. So many bad ideas. Anyways, all right, I've given some time to Kevin and Mike to come up with something.
So I guess I'm starting to watch Tropical Storm Dorian like everyone else, especially people in Florida. And it's going to be passing near Barbados and the island soon. So I'll probably be checking out the Tropical Cyclone Radar Loops website that Brian McNulty has. So if people are not aware of that, that's always an interesting website to use when we have tropical cyclones coming close to radar sites. Usually gets a feed up there of the radar loop.
Great, thanks, Kevin.
I think I missed the purpose of this exercise, because one of the things that I wanted to draw people's attention to was a great headline from a couple months ago. Severe storms damaged 3rd Air Force Base in 8 months. And the reason I liked this piece was it's this idea that when we think of at-risk housing, we tend to focus on manufactured mobile housing. And from some of the work Kevin and I did, we realized that there was a lot of other things that probably should fall in that category. Fast-built student housing, tiny homes, which are kind of taking off, and frankly, a lot of barracks and immediately off-base housing, which affects millions of U.S. residents every year as they live next to these large military centers as part of their work and livelihood. So I would draw people's attention to some of the storm damage that has affected some of the greater base communities in the U.S.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that's wonderful. All right. Well, we are getting hit by the winds now, so I'm going to sign off. John, do you want to give us the grand benediction?
The grand benediction, sure. Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, you've been listening to WeatherBrains. It's the weekly webcast that airs at 9:30 every Monday evening in the East, 8:30 in Central Time. Kim, take care of yourself. Be safe. And I want to thank both Kevin and Mike for being with us this evening. This conversation really deserves another show. I feel like we've just kind of scratched the surface. And the data and the research that you guys are doing is critical. I mean, it really is, to try to keep the population safe and also to provide more information on this very topic. I don't think we know enough about it. And individual reaction to severe weather and to risk, I think we're just scratching the surface. So I want to thank both of you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. So if you've got email for us, send it to email@weatherbrains.com, and we will try to get Aubrey on next week and have her read through that email. Until then, I'm John Scala. Thank you for joining us this evening. Have a great one. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Will. Great show tonight. Great conversation, great discussion, mobile homes, tornado warnings, severe weather safety. I'm going to go back and listen to this one probably tomorrow on the audio side. So got to go back and finish the news back here. Thank you guys for watching or listening. We'll see you guys next Monday night. Y'all have a marvelous week, and God bless.